What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my DLC review for Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader's The Infinite Museion DLC, which should be releasing right around the same time this particular video goes live, which is of course possible because Owlcat gave me early access to this DLC so I could bring you guys this review. What's more, however, because this DLC is integrated into the main campaign and takes place across multiple acts of a very long game, they also provided save files to make sure that you could see all of the content, which I used, which has been the case in the past as well for some of their DLCs. And while usually the achievements aren't active, this time they were, and some of the save files they gave me were activating the achievements, which is a little annoying to me personally, but it does happen sometimes. Kind of just part of the job on that front. But this is necessary because even though I have save files from all across the game, if you were to jump into Act 5 to try to see the content there, that save file wouldn't have my past decisions in the DLC, and so to go through it organically would be essentially a full playthrough of the game, and they're not giving me that kind of time with the DLC. They were still patching stuff as of like a couple days ago. Either way, however, I was able to jump in and take a look at all the new stuff, and I of course wanted to bring you guys my thoughts on it. The Infinite Museion DLC brings us a brand new augmentation system, a new companion with his own playstyle, changes to some of the base game systems and various things you can encounter, though do keep in mind I do not have the patch notes for the base game that they usually put out alongside the DLC. So I won't be able to comment on any of that stuff because I don't know all of what they've changed. But there are some changes to specific things like a companion I want to talk about. And then of course the actual content of the DLC itself. And so let's dive into that. But one final warning before we do. There are going to be some mild base game spoilers for this. I'm going to try not to spoil much of the DLC beyond what is necessary. But there is actually one thing I want to talk about that is just kind of straight up a spoiler for the main game. First up though, let's talk a little about this augmentation system. I did in fact do a video covering the augmentation system already because they put out the details early, and so if you've watched that you'll get the gist here, and I'm going to go kind of quick as a result. Basically, you are able to replace body parts with augmentations, cybernetic limbs, that kind of thing, and these come with powers and abilities that you'll be able to activate at a bit of a cost. Some of them literally have negatives attached to them, but all of them increase your susceptibility to shock damage. Each piece increases your damage taken by 15%, in fact, giving you a bit of a weakness if you go all in. Some of these augmentations can be overclocked or galvanized for extra effect, and you're going to find these augmentations all throughout the game as loot now. This is a DLC system, it is not part of the base game, mind you. However, they have changed a bit of the base game to accommodate for this system. Some of your companions who have visible augmentations have now had them like formally added into this system. So base game you won't really be able to do anything with that if you don't own the DLC, but if you have the DLC you can swap them out with new stuff as well. Now you also cannot augment every single companion. A couple of them will refuse outright. Some of them you simply don't have the facilities to do so, like the Space Marine. But speaking of facilities, in order to use this system you're going to have to get a hold of the Sector Bionica, which will just open up on your ship naturally through gameplay, and in order to activate it you have to bring on board the new companion, Eogan Febris. More on him in a moment. And you can also upgrade this as well, which will give you access to better and better implants with better and better facilities, of course. So there's a bit of a system there, as you would expect. These augmentations, though, seriously do affect a ton of stuff. They give tons of abilities and mix up playstyles across every single archetype or class, and to that end, I can see why they chose not to add an archetype this time around, given that they're already kind of changing a little bit of all of them with these additions, and I would almost certainly expect some patches and follow-ups to this as more and more people get a hold of this. Pretty wild system overall, but as I mentioned, in order to use it, you're actually going to have to first talk with Eogan Febris. Now, funnily enough, the Adeptus Mechanicus seems to sort of force this guy onto you, and you probably find out pretty quick why, because Eogan, while being a manipulus of the Adeptus Mechanicus, is a bit of an oddball who talks to a completely silent servo skull. and is very clearly a guy haunted by his past, and that forms the crux of his companion story, which he does have. There are a few quests. You help him out with some experiments early on where he's trying to force 3 bodies into one and the guy's mind breaks, and you can get to the bottom of why he's performing experiments about that, and why that despite his somewhat jovial exterior, he does have a sort of brooding energy lingering on the edge of his conversations. Now, you need Eogan to activate the Sector Bionica, and then you can choose to take him on as a companion or not. You'll have access to it regardless afterward, and that happens like right at the beginning of Act 2. That's when you'll meet this guy, and that's when the DLC stuff starts coming into play, and then over the course of 2, 4, and 5 is when all of it happens. More on that in a moment. Now, Eogan is manipulous, and so that comes with a few extra things. He is heavily augmented, as is typical for the Adeptus Mechanicus, and he has a bunch of unique augmentations due to him being a manipulus, which also affects his play style. These guys store energy in their stomach, more or less, and then can expel that and use it to modify the people around them. This is more or less his play style. He can literally discharge this energy in like a little chain lightning thing, but he can also use it to, of course, power up and buff the people around him. And so in that way, he does play as a bit more of a support character than anything else. But there are like special manipulous augmentations you can get to take that even farther if you so choose. But speaking of the Adeptus Mechanicus and Forge worlds, you may well be thinking to yourself that one of the origins of this game are the Forge world characters. They all should have an augment as per their little sub-bonuses, and that is in fact the case. Picking that home world actually gives you that special augmentation, just so you're aware that does function a bit differently now. Now, here's where we get into a slight bit of a spoiler, because a bit of a surprise to me, I didn't realize they were doing this. They actually revamped Eurolon. Now, if you are unaware, and the reason this is a spoiler is that Eurolon is one of the secret companions on the heretic path. He's supposed to be a big heretic space marine, and he was kind of terrible. His build was not good. They've revamped that entirely to make him more useful, though, I mean, realistically, he's only available in Chapter 5, and thus isn't going to be that much use across the game anyway, but he is now not totally useless. He's able to run in and do typical Space Marine stuff. He can also use some of that Heretic Astartes power, if you will, to summon in various demons to assist you in combat that will be under your control, and it doesn't get much more heretical than that. Though, to be clear, they are not literally under your control. They act on their own. They are simply not attacking you, alongside some other changes that make him just generally more useful. And all of that is well and good, but what about the actual DLC? Well, the DLC primarily takes place across several new areas that have been added to the game, that of course revolve around Trazyn the Infinite and his infinite Museion. Unsurprisingly, we are going to one of those sections of the Museion, alongside several other places. So we get the new Sector Bionica, where we'll be doing our augments. Eogan gets some special areas dedicated to his companion quest. There's some additional quests involved in upgrading your Sector Bionica now, which can see you dealing with a quest with the Adeptus Mechanicus, having trouble with an oil rig that you have to get to the bottom of. But primarily, we are here to talk about Zarkov and the actual Infinite Museion. A new location we have here is Zarkov. This is a frontier world that, once you deal with what's going on there, is going to act as a new colony for you to manage in the colony management side of things. Unsurprisingly, given the DLC, they mostly deal in augmentations, as you would probably expect, and when you first go there, you're actually looking for some information about one of your ancestors, which is sort of what's spurring all of this on. I don't want to spoil this too much here, but the gist of it is basically that Trazyn the Infinite has a vested interest in the Von Valancius dynasty, and in sort of trying to track down this ancestor of yours, you find yourself inadvertently drawn into the machinations of Trazyn the Infinite, which then has wide-reaching effects beyond just this little story. There's a sort of, I guess you could say, bad ending to the DLC, which gets you an ending slide, which is funny. There's actual stuff that can happen in the genuine ending. And so there's a lot going on here. But when you first arrive on Zarkov, you find that a bunch of soldiers that were part of your dynasty in the past were stationed here, basically waiting for reinforcements, which just so happens to be you, as they try to deal with this planet-wide problem that manifests in what they call the drover, this giant plant-like growth that can be an issue. And once you deal with this thing, congratulations, you've got your own colony now. But as you look into what happened to your ancestor, you can then come across the Museion. And then once you get in there, we have all sorts of unique encounters even just beyond the Drover. Now the thing about the Museion is, as the name would somewhat imply, it is full of all sorts of exhibits, things that Trazen has taken and sort of frozen in time and, put on display as it happens. And we're going to get involved in a lot of that stuff. And some of that's pretty cool. Some of it relates directly to your Von Valancius dynasty. Some of it is around the death corpse of Krieg, which I know is not pronounced that way. It's just how I like to say it because it sounds way cooler. Either way, though, you can meet some of them in here alongside other Necrons, like for instance a big fight with a Chronomancer, and lots of other interesting experiences before ultimately coming face to face with Trazen himself, which you have a few potential ways of dealing with, as this is a big CRPG focused on choice and consequence after all. And all of that does nothing to mention anything about the secrets that you can get up to. There are various puzzles and other little bits and bobs that have been added in. And those are some pretty unique and interesting encounters just because of the nature in which you experience them being pretty different. But even just beyond the novelty of them, they do actually mess around with some interesting mechanics this time around. For instance, the Chronomancer puts a timer on your extra turns. Extra turns are pretty powerful in Rogue Trader. When you fight the Chronomancer, though, when you give a character an extra turn, you're forced to do that turn in 30 seconds, and thanks to the way some of the buffs and stuff work, that can be a little bit limiting. And so that was a fun system to mess around with, and then of course these fights also give you an opportunity to test out and mess around with the various augmentations that have been added as well. And so, putting all of that together, the Infinite Museion is interesting in the sense that I don't think it hits the highs of Void Shadows or even Lex Imperialis in terms of just like strong characters and stuff beyond Trazen himself. Not to say there's not really cool moments, there's actually a fair bit of like cinematic moments involved in this DLC, but rather the companion we get this time around, Eogan, just doesn't have the charisma of Cabela or Solomorn even. Or perhaps I should say Solomorn Cyberdog. But putting all of that together, what you have is basically another 10 to 15 hours of content added to the base game that add also systems that touch basically everything, the extra colony, the augmentation system, which is going to wildly change the gameplay and everything. And so while I can see some people being disappointed with this just because we already have an Adeptus Mechanicus companion, we're not getting a new archetype this time around, etc. I think when you put it into the context of everything it does for the base game and expands upon, it's still good DLC, even if it isn't as good as something like Void Shadows, because Void Shadows was crazy awesome. But long story short, I think this DLC is good, and if anything, I think Owlcat might be having a little trouble following up Void Shadows in particular. They led with that first DLC being so strong. It's really hard not to compare the later DLC to it, at least for me anyway, and overall, again, the Infinite Museion here is good. It touches a ton of different systems across the game, does some important stuff there. And the actual main focus of the DLC, the stuff with Trazen the Infinite, has all sorts of interesting and unique encounters you're not going to see anywhere else, with mechanics you don't really see anywhere else, alongside an interesting story about the Von Valancius dynasty. And so, if all of that sounds good to you, then it's a pretty good DLC. And in combination with the first two DLCs that have been added, which already improved the game a great deal, I gotta say this game is starting to get massive, and we still have one more DLC to go. At which point I will dive back into it and do a full re-review with all of the DLC and update my guides and the like at some point afterwards. Now, I don't have the exact pricing for you. I believe most of the Rogue Trader ones have been going for like $17, something like that. And the Season Pass 2 for this one and the next DLC is $30 as well. So right in that range somewhere. And again, I think whether or not that's worth it for you depends on how much you are interested in these systems, or of course the story around Trazen the Infinite. But I think that is pretty much going to do it for this particular video. Certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know how you feel about this DLC, especially if you jump in to check it out for yourself as it is launching today. And I'd love to know what people wind up thinking about it. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.